everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, today I wanted to talk about the role of third party electoral campaigns in American politics. And a lot of people tell us, well, you're never going to win if you run a third party presidential campaign, for example. So, why bother? What's the point? Well, there are other things we can do besides win that contribute to social change. Now, you do often hear supporters of progressive third parties such as the Green Party that if we can get to 5% in a presidential campaign, that that will pay off in terms of federal funding for campaigns and ballot access in the future. And that's certainly true. But what I want to focus on today is the role that third parties have played in shaping the course of American history, generally for the better. So, first of all, I just want to go through an article here that talks about the role of third-party electoral politics in the movement to abolish slavery in the United States. So this is an old article from the website of the now defunct socialist group, Socialist Workers' Party. And the point that Keith Rosenthal and Alan Moss try to drive home in this article is that third-party election efforts historically played an important part in advancing progressive causes in the U.S. And in this article, they use as a case study the role of various third-party initiatives in the movement to abolish slavery. So as I say, in the decades preceding the Civil War, the two ruling class political parties that dominated the U.S. system were the Democrats and the Whigs. The Democrats were the party of slavery. They were dominated by the Southern slave-owning master class and consistently advocated the expansion of slavery into states that the U.S. incorporated as it expanded westward. The Whigs were the second main party from 1833 onward, and appealed primarily to the northern ruling class that was becoming more powerful on the basis of industrial production. So the northern industrialists clashed with southern slave owners over a wide range of political issues: trade, tariffs, spending on infrastructure development. And the Whigs tried to sort of compromise between these two groups with a, as they put it, measured policy of compromise and conciliation, prizing national unity above all else. Probably the best known national leader of the Whigs was Henry Clay, who was known as a great compromiser for his role in brokering a series of legislative compromises that papered over the divisions between the North and the slave-owning South. So, on a question of whether slavery should be legal in new Western territories as they became states, the Democrats unequivocally supported making them slave states, while the Whigs argued that whether or not a new state should be a slave state or a state where slavery was not legal should be decided by popular vote. And of course, we know what they mean by that, right? At the time, it was typically white, not always, but typically white men who had a certain amount of affluence. So basically, the Whigs were the lesser evil party compared to the Democrats at that particular time. The Democrats unequivocally supported slavery. The Whigs kind of waffled. But the lesser evil is still evil, right? That's the slogan. And the most determined opponents of slavery at this time viewed the Whigs as part of a political system that was completely committed to upholding the institution of slavery. So, the Whigs certainly weren't going to abolish slavery. So, far from viewing the Whigs as a lesser evil, even though in a certain sense they were, the dominant attitude among abolitionists in this era was to reject any participation in the U.S. political system. So just don't run any political candidates at all. But gradually, some abolitionists, such as Frederick Douglass, started pushing a different strategy. Rather than choosing between the two evils, Democrats and Whigs, they wanted to support independent political parties committed to confronting slavery directly. And so in 1840, they ran a presidential candidate. The Liberty Party was formed, an abolitionist anti-slavery party, and James Birney ran as their presidential candidate in the 1840 presidential election. And he won 0.3% of the vote. Oh, okay, that's interesting. So yeah, here's the results of the 1840 presidential election. You might say, based on these numbers, so more than 1 million votes for the mainstream parties, and about 7,000 votes for the anti-slavery Liberty Party. Give it up, but Liberty Party. You're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to change anything. But Bernie ran again in 1844. This time, he won 2.3% of the popular vote. But that year, it was a very close contest between the Whig candidate, Henry Clay, and the Democratic candidate, James Polk. Polk, the Democrat, did win the popular vote by about 40,000 votes. Now, let's look at these results. Okay, so you have Polk winning by just a little over 1% there. But James Birney got 2.3%. And guess what? He was a spoiler, so to speak, because in New York, Bernie got 3.25% of the vote. It's James Birney, that is, not Bernie Sanders. And his 15,800 votes was several times the difference between Henry Clay and James Polk. Polk won the state by about 5,000 votes. So, as you might expect, the Whig Party was just apoplectic about this and very angry at the abolitionists and at the Liberty Party for supposedly spoiling their candidate Henry Clay's election. In fact, they were angry beforehand that this anti-slavery candidate, Bernie, was running. Let's see. As Peter Camejo, one of the founders of the Green Party, wrote about the Liberty Party, amazing as it may sound, the Liberty Party received some of its most hostile reception from people who claim to oppose slavery, including some committed and active abolitionists. They attacked the new party because of what they perceived as a spoiler factor that could take votes from the Whigs, allowing the Democrats to win in close elections. The Liberty Party responded by saying it was a matter of principle not to vote for political parties that supported slavery. They dared to raise the idea that abolitionists should seek to win control of the U.S. government to abolish slavery. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? We have the same back and forth today where the Democrats accuse us, third-party voters who are to their left, of being spoilers. Or, they actually accuse the candidates of being spoilers, which is kind of weird because candidates only have one vote, just like everybody else. And our counter argument to that is, well, look, you can't spoil a system that's already rotten. Both parties, for the most part, support, for instance, the war in Ukraine. Neither party supports universal health care and so on and so forth. So we're going to say, we're not going to hold our nose and vote for a candidate that shares basically almost none of our views, just because we might think that, one or the other of the major party candidates, or that candidate, whichever one it is, whether it's, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, as it was in 2020. Look, neither one of these candidates are acceptable. So, as a matter of principle, I'm going to vote for somebody who isn't completely awful and who, furthermore, isn't accused of raping anybody, as both Biden and Trump were. But anyway, back to the history of the abolitionist third party challenge. So, Bernie and the Liberty Party were accused of winning enough support in New York that would otherwise have gone to Clay to swing that state to Polk. And its 36 electoral votes at that time were the margin of victory for Polk in the Electoral College. Now, bear in mind, Polk had won the popular vote anyway, which wasn't the case with George Bush in 2000 or Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016. Did that make the abolitionists' election spoilers? The authors ask. There's no doubt that James Polk was one of the most rabidly pro-slavery Democratic presidents, but the Whigs, with their compromises, were just as responsible for admitting new slave states into the Union. So you admit a state, and people there vote to have slavery, and you have a new slave state. So those who wanted to see an end to slavery continued to support third-party efforts that would actually challenge slavery. First, the Free Soil Party formed in the wake of the 1844 election, succeeding the Liberty Party, and being a little bit bigger, although somewhat less radical. And finally, the Republican Party was founded in 1854. So the Republican Party actually started out as a third party. And then in 1856, they beat the Whig Party in the presidential election, and the general lack of success of the Whig Party, both in the presidential race and elsewhere, led to their speedy demise, and the Republican Party became the second major party. But it started out as a third party. And the Republican Party, like the Free Soil Party before it, was firmly opposed to the expansion of slavery westward. although it didn't stand for abolition in the current slave states. That came a bit later. Much of the party leadership was more moderate than the abolitionists on the question of slavery itself. Their opposition to expansion of slavery was about challenging the power of the Southern ruling class. So the third party challengers over several decades contributed to a political crisis I already talked about that. The Whigs, who changed their name to the American Party, only won 21% in the 1856 presidential election versus the Republicans' 33%. And then in 1860, Lincoln, of course, was elected as the Republican candidate. And a lot of abolitionists were disappointed in all this. They thought of Lincoln as kind of a sellout. But Frederick Douglass, perhaps the most famous of the slavery abolitionists, challenged them to set aside their doubts and not boycott the 1860 election. His argument was that a victory for Lincoln and the Republicans really would open the way for this great work by putting the federal government in the hands of a party that would stop the expansion of slavery into new territories and thereby fatally undermine the power of the South. Abolitionists were only one factor in the third party challenges in the decade before the Civil War, but their understanding of what they were fighting for and how they should conduct the struggle holds lessons today. They understood that organizing a political challenge to slavery might mean temporarily tipping the balance in favor of the greater evil against the lesser evil, but that retreating in the face of this threat would only perpetuate the pro-slavery duopoly. Okay, now let's turn to a broader summary of third party electoral politics and its contributions to social progress in the United States that I wrote 3 years ago. So, the theme of my article was just countering the various attempts to shame third party voters or candidates that the political establishment, mainly Democrats, engaged in. If you don't vote for Biden, you're electing Trump, but I'm not voting for Trump either, so am I electing Biden? Okay, so moving forward in history a bit. In 1886, the Independent Labor Party was formed by trade unions in New York and ran radical economist Henry George for mayor on a platform including such demands as the 8-hour-a-day. And famously, there was a major strike and protest campaign in 1886 on behalf of the 8-hour-day, whereas at the time it was typical for factories to work 12 hours a day or even longer, and often work at least one day on the weekends. And then on May Day, what we now know as May Day in 1886 in Chicago, there was a massacre. A bombing took place that killed some people, and some labor organizers were framed for the bombing and executed, and that's the basis of what we now know as Labor Day. But anyway, back to this electoral race in 1886, which I would assume was working with the campaigners elsewhere in the country on the 8-hour day. So Henry George advocated that, plus equal pay for women and municipal ownership of streetcars. George finished second ahead of future U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Then later on, the People's Party, which grew out of the populist movement during the last third of the 19th century, campaigned against big agribusiness and Wall Street. And in 1892, its candidate for president, James Weaver, won 8% of the vote. The populists were absorbed into the Democratic Party within a few years. And as we all know, the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements, right? But so, their advocacy didn't really accomplish that much. But close on its heels was the Socialist Party, formed, I forget the exact date, but late 1890s. And the Socialist Party went on to elect thousands of candidates to local and state office and to members of Congress. Eugene Debs was the co-founder of the Socialist Party. He was from Terre Haute, Indiana, about an hour away from where I live, and you can visit his house there, which has been turned into a museum. Eugene Debs wound up running for president 5 times, starting in 1900, and won nearly 1 million votes in 1920, while he was in prison as a result of his protesting World War I under the Espionage Act, the same exact act that's been used to prosecute Julian Assange. So they were able to exert political pressure as a result of their campaigns and outside agitation that led to various political reforms during the early 1900s, including a progressive income tax, labor laws, antitrust legislation, and health and safety regulations, as well as the right of women to vote in 1920. The Socialist Party was the first American political party to advocate for women's right to vote and women's equality generally. And of course, so Uncle Sam's going after the Socialist Party, the Palmer raids and imprisonment of Eugene Debs and other anti-war activists and so forth, weakened the Socialist Party considerably. But then along came the Communist Party, inspired by the Russian Revolution. It grew into a formidable force in the labor movement in the 1920s and 1930s. It played a leading role in union organizing and major strikes all over the country, as well as organizations of poor rural farmers and unemployed people. And, of course, they ran candidates. And so with party activists playing a leading role, social movements in the 1930s pressured the U.S. government to enact the New Deal. And just as before, with the Communist Party, many of its leaders were jailed under trumped-up charges. But one other interesting thing about the Communist Party is that it was the first U.S. political party to fully embrace racial equality. And black and white members alike played important roles in the not only the movement of the 30s, but the subsequent civil rights movement. It's highly unlikely that the social movements of the 1930s would have been successful in winning the reforms of the New Deal, including the right to organize labor unions, had it not been for the ability of the Communist Party to promote cooperation between black and white activists and union members. So, and there were various other third-party efforts that came and went um, over the next few decades, and then in 1984, the Green Party, founded by um, co-founded by Peter Camejo, who I mentioned earlier, um, and it advocated for equal rights for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, including gay marriage, right from its inception in 1984. It was also the first political party in the United States to advocate for single-payer national health care insurance, ultimately branded Medicare for all in the U.S. And it also began advocating for legalization of marijuana several decades ago, and now it's gradually um, state by state becoming legal in the United States. The Green New Deal was also originally proposed by the Green Party in 2006, and it was much more comprehensive and radical in its um, proposals for measures to cope with climate change than the 2019 congressional resolution introduced by AOC and Edward Markey, which a congressional resolution is toothless. It doesn't really do anything, and it didn't go anywhere. Joe Biden, of course, promised to veto it famously during the 2020 presidential campaign. And all of the above contributions of left-wing third parties to social change in the U.S. occurred with precious few instances where third-party votes could credibly be argued to have cost a quote-unquote lesser evil establishment candidate the election. And as I talked about the other night, this presumption that votes for third parties or running third-party candidacies somehow costs. Is somehow capable of costing the Democrats an election is based on the presumption that somehow the Democrats own our votes, and of course they don't. They're our votes, and most of us don't support either Democrats or Republicans. Would not vote for them even if those were the only two choices in a presidential election. Which they never are, of course. There's always third parties. Of course, the 1844 presidential election that we talked about earlier was a possible exception to that. But, again, for you to make that case that the 5,000 vote margin of Polk winning New York over Clay was because of there were that many thousand voters who were anti-slavery who considered voting for Clay, who was himself a slave owner. Maybe not. But we all know, as I just discussed earlier, the subsequent history. Even though James Burney received 3 times as many votes as the margin by which Andrew Jackson won New York, within 19 years of that election, slavery was abolished. Within a decade of 1844, or a little less than a decade, a little more than a decade, the Whig Party virtually ceased to exist, and the Republican Party came along, which elected Lincoln, and he abolished slavery. And there are examples of third parties playing a significant role in major social reforms in other countries. Quite abundant examples, actually. Even countries like Canada and the UK, with electoral systems just as hostile to third parties' electoral success as the United States. So in Canada, for instance, we had the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, a socialist party that governed the province of Saskatchewan from 1944 to 1960. Imagine that in Saskatchewan. If you know anything about Canada, That's not exactly a bastion of socialism, but a socialist party governed Saskatchewan for 16 years. And then it was succeeded by the New Democratic Party, the current third party in Canada. Um, so the CCF and the NDP played major roles in the introduction of universal health care in Saskatchewan in 1962 and nationally in 1968. And you have a similar story in the UK, where the Labour Party, which was founded in 1900, ultimately became Britain's second leading party during World War I, just as the Republican Party had originally been a third party in the United States and became the leading party in the United States not too long after its founding. And then the Labour Party became the governing party for quite a while following World War One, and implemented many major reforms, including the National Health Service, Britain's form of quasi-socialized medicine. So in short, voting for third-party candidates isn't a wasted vote. It doesn't typically, quote unquote, spoil the election of major party candidates who don't own our votes anyway. It isn't a reflection of privilege. It doesn't make you a purist. It's just one of the tools of oppressed groups and their allies as they fight for justice. Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about today. I hope you liked this video. So please put a like on it and share it and subscribe to the channel. And I will see you next time. And next time, by the way, well, if not before then, will probably be Sunday night when I do what I'm hoping will be a weekly live stream. And this week, I'm hoping to take a look at the decision by the Cornel West campaign to hire Peter Dow, the former Democratic Party political operative, as its campaign organizer. So stay tuned for that. And I have several other things on the agenda for Sunday. So please join me Sunday at 8 and share your thoughts. And we'll talk about some stuff. All right. See you later.